Hello everyone, I'm Ron Berger and this is the Astrology News Report, an alternate view of world events as seen through the lens of Vedic astrology. Today is July 19th, 2020. This is the special report section where I take a topic or person or situation that is pertinent to world events and do an in-depth astrological analysis. This will be a special predictive report on the charts of Joe Biden and Donald Trump and how they match up going into the November 2020 election. First, let's take a brief look at each of their charts individually. Donald Trump is Leo Rising. Leo is the sign of the king. It's natural for a Leo person to want to rule everybody. Leo also needs approval and acknowledgement. Leo needs trusted, loyal lieutenants, and is therefore subject to betrayal. Now, notice that Trump's natal Mars is closely conjunct his ascendant degree. This makes him a very Mars-type person. Mars is the planet of action, aggression, and combat. Trump needs action, likes to fight, and since Leo has a strong ego, he's gotta win. Now, see that the ascendant ruler, the sun, is up at the top of the chart in the very materialistic sign Taurus. Taurus wants wealth and property, and Trump's sun is closely conjunct Rahu, the eclipse point, the signifier of ambition and material success. But Rahu in Vedic mythology is a demon, and since demons are corrupt, Rahu in the 10th house of success signifies gaining that success by whatever means necessary. In other words, by unscrupulous, dishonorable means. Uranus, the planet of independence and rebellion, participates in this natal conjunction, making Mr. Trump a law unto himself. Note that Donald Trump's natal moon is directly opposite his sun. In other words, he was born on a full moon. His moon is in Scorpio, a very intuitive sign, and closely conjunct Ketu, the significator of past karma and of the unseen dimension. Ketu conjunct natal moon in Scorpio is what gives him preternatural instincts. He has an uncanny ability to find weakness in the other person and to take advantage of people. That, combined with his aggressive Mars, makes Mr. Trump a formidable opponent. Okay, we'll get back to Mr. Trump's chart in a bit. Now let's consider some of the essentials of Joe Biden's chart. Mr. Biden has Scorpio as his rising sign, with natal Sun and natal Venus conjunct the ascendant degree. Scorpio has a natural inclination to seek power, and gets power by association. So Scorpio is the sign of forming alliances. And indeed, Mr. Biden is famous for his efforts during his decades-long career in the U.S. Senate for forming alliances. Scorpio is also known for some unsavory characteristics. It's the sign of conspiracy and intrigue, and can be vengeful if wronged. Fortunately, Mr. Biden is born with Venus conjunct his ascendant. The planet of relationship, compromise, agreement, and guidance does much to correct some of the downsides of the Scorpio ascendant and instead maximize Scorpio's desire to attain goals by forming alliances. The sun is the planet of will and power, and is what keeps Mr. Biden motivated to achieve his goals. When Venus combines with the sun, it gives one a loving spirit. But Venus in Scorpio also adds to Scorpio's passionate feelings. Biden's natal moon is in Aries, a sign noted for taking on challenges and diving headlong into things. Note that his moon is in the Ashvini Nakshatra, the lunar sign associated with helping others and with healing. and this is in his 6th house, the house of work and service and solving problems. This is what gives Mr. Biden the karma of serving the public and the desire to fix, to heal the nation. But the 6th house is also the house of enemies. So Mr. Biden's good intentions don't always work out in his favor. In both of these charts, we see that there are important planets in the 12th house. The 12th is the house of the unknown, including unknown people. In other words, the masses. Having a connection with the masses is, of course, important for any politician. In Mr. Trump's chart, it's his natal Venus, ruler of the 10th house sign Taurus, therefore signifying career and status, and his natal Saturn, ruler of his 6th house sign Capricorn, and thus the house of work, struggle, and difficulties. So his work and his career involve the masses, and since Venus is the planet of pleasure, his career includes building pleasure palaces, as well as providing entertainment for the masses. But since the 6th house ruler Saturn also represents his enemies, and the 12th house is the house of hidden things, he ends up with a lot of hidden enemies, which is a big problem for Leo rising, because Leo is subject to betrayal anyway. Since Venus represents guidance and females, his enemies can be his advisors and or female. Now consider Biden's 12th house. We see that Mars, the ruler of his Scorpio ascendant, resides in the house of the masses. And additionally, Venus, the ruler of the 12th house sign Libra, is placed in his 1st house, creating a Parivartana Yoga, an exchange of house rulers, which makes Joe Biden firmly connected, even identified, with the masses. And indeed, he sees himself as a man of the people, and is always referring to his humble working class origin. Mars also represents the 6th house of a Scorpio rising chart, so, like with Trump, he serves the masses, but is also subject to hidden enemies. Additionally, there is Mercury, planet of communications, in this sector of Mr. Biden's chart, making him ideally suited for communicating with the public. Mercury, as the ruler of Virgo, brings in the energy of the 11th house of goals and ambitions and of friendship. So he not only identifies with the masses, he thinks of himself as a friend of the public. But Mercury also represents his 8th house of chronic problems, big changes, secrets, and scandals. And since it is sharing the sign with Mercury's enemy, Mars, his communications get screwed up at times, as he has demonstrated many times by his frequent gaffes. Besides having an emphasis on the 12th house, another interesting similarity between the two charts is that both have Rahu in the 10th house, with Ketu in the 4th. Having Rahu, the signifier of great desire, even obsession, in the house of status and position, is what gives both men the drive to succeed in life and acquire status. Ketu in the 4th house is not so good for home life, implying some sacrifice or surrender of the domestic comforts for the sake of achieving success and renown. Now, let's compare where each of these guys are in their planetary period timeline. Mr. Trump is in a Jupiter major period, which began right around the time he got elected, November 2016. Jupiter is a mixed bag for Leo rising charts, since it represents the 5th house of romance and children and good past life credit, but also the 8th house of big changes, chronic problems, secrets, and scandals. Jupiter is placed in his 2nd house of personal finances, family, and speech, showing that a lot of his success, as well as his problems, stem from financial matters, family members, and what comes out of his mouth. Turns out, Mr. Biden is also in a Jupiter major period. In his case, Jupiter karma got activated back in 2006. Note that Jupiter is retrograde in both charts, indicating that more of what Jupiter promises, both good and bad, gets delivered later in its period. In Mr. Biden's chart, Jupiter is placed in his 9th house of good fortune, and it's in Cancer, its sign of exaltation. For Scorpio Rising charts, Jupiter represents the karma of the 2nd house of money and family and speaking, as well as his 5th house of guidance, children, and good past life credit. Note that having the ruler of the 2nd house of speech in the 9th house of beliefs means you speak your truth. As of January 2019, Mr. Trump began a Saturn sub-period. Saturn is a tough planet for Leo rising charts. Saturn is the bitter enemy of the Sun, the Leo chart ruler, and represents both the 7th house of the opponent, as well as the 6th house of struggles and difficulties and enemies. Trump's natal Saturn is placed in his 12th house of hidden actions and loss, which is also the house of the subconscious. Trump's enemies are living rent-free in his brain. So, this is not a good year for the Donald. Mr. Biden, on the other hand, has just recently entered his Rahu sub-period in April of this year. Rahu activates his 10th house karma of ambition for success, status, and position. Note that Rahu is in Leo, the sign of rulership. This gives Mr. Biden the destiny to rule. But remember that Rahu is a demon, and demons can be tricky. So, despite appearing to be all ethical and moral, Mr. Biden could be doing things that are not totally on the up and up. Now, here's something interesting. Note that Joe Biden's natal Rahu is nearly exactly conjunct Trump's natal ascendant degree. Both are right around 7 degrees Leo. Remember that Rahu is an eclipse point. Joe Biden's sub-period ruler is eclipsing the most personal point of Mr. Trump's natal chart. And indeed, since April, Biden has been steadily rising in the polls, now eclipsing Trump by double digits. Okay, how about the transiting planets? When we come to the election day, the positive and negative transits will have a lot to say how it all turns out. Saturn is the reality check planet, so let's look at Saturn first. Well, here we are. Saturn will be in position to be exactly opposing Trump's natal Venus and exactly opposing Biden's natal Jupiter on the very day of the election. Saturn is the planet of restriction. In Trump's chart, Saturn opposing Venus restricts his popularity with the masses. In Mr. Biden's chart, Saturn opposing his natal Jupiter restricts his good fortune. But there are some other differences worth noting here. Saturn transiting in its own sign in Trump's 6th house of enemies makes his enemies more persistent and hard to defeat. Saturn transiting in Mr. Biden's 3rd house of making efforts gives him more resolve, making him harder to defeat. Okay, what about Jupiter? Both Biden and Trump are in Jupiter major periods, the planet of beneficence, good fortune, opportunity, faith, and wisdom will be transiting in its own sign, Sagittarius, on election day. So, this should be significant. For Joe Biden, it's his 2nd house of speech. For Donald Trump, it's his 5th house of creativity and guidance. But the big issue here is what Pluto is going to be doing, because Pluto will be in a tight conjunction with Jupiter on November 3rd. Pluto signifies the larger context. It's the planet of mass events, generational change, rebirth, and regeneration. So, in this case, it looks like the big picture is going to overwhelm whatever good Jupiter can do for either of them. What about Rahu and Ketu? The nodes change signs, entering Taurus and Scorpio in mid-September. That puts Rahu in Trump's 10th house and in a tight conjunction with his natal 10th house planets. Remember, Rahu is a significator of obsession, and since it's an eclipse point, Rahu's great desire obscures and distorts the meaning of whatever it affects, in this case his natal Sun, planet of ego, natal Rahu, signifier of destiny, and natal Uranus, signifier of independence. Meanwhile, the Ketu transit conjuncts Trump's natal moon and doubles up on his natal Ketu, which makes his emotions even more volatile. In Mr. Biden's chart, Rahu will be transiting in his 7th house, making him obsessed with his direct opponent. Ketu will be transiting in his ascendant, signifying the need to make personal changes. But at least for Mr. Biden, there is no direct connection with natal planets on November 3rd. And then there's Mars. Mars is, after all, the planet of battles and victory. So what's Mars doing on Election Day? Well, Mars is in trouble because it will be retrograde. The planet of action and victory doesn't like being held back in the zodiac. This makes Mars very malefic, a bad Mars. Mars will be in Pisces, one of Jupiter's signs. So again, an emphasis for both contenders, since they are both in Jupiter major periods. In Donald Trump's chart, retrograde Mars will be in his 8th house of secrets, scandals, and humiliation. This is a really nasty situation, made worse because Mars will be simultaneously directly opposite his natal Jupiter. For Joe Biden, retrograde Mars will be in his 5th house, where it can cause some problems, for instance, getting proper advice. But nothing like what Donald Trump will be experiencing. And then there's the third party to all of this, the voters. They are, after all, a critical component. But that will be a topic for another report, which I will be doing in the not-too-distant future. So, that'll be all for today.